Hello and welcome to the show. This is Do All the Things. And today we have a 1970 Sunn Sorado and it needs some help. Sunn. They are famous, but I don't know that the Sorado is. It's not exactly a insert popular Sunn amp here because I never really paid that much attention to them. This one's a little bit less sought after. And as far as I know, the previous owner got a really good deal on it, which is why they didn't bother to pay to get it fixed. Because it was going to cost more to repair it than I think they spent on it, and maybe even more than it would cost them to acquire another, newer, more appropriate amp. Either way, this guy is supposed to be a bass head, and it's, rather simple going on here. We got a couple boosts, volume, treble, bass, and that's about it. That's really about it. And if we look in the back, it's equally as barren. The tubes are currently removed, but, a rectifier, 2 KT88s it was rated for, and 2 preamp tubes. One's hiding over here, and one's right here. The design here is rather clever. I think so anyway. You see, normally, an amp might have the 2 gain stages, sure, and then it'll have another 2 gain stages and then the phase inverter. But they don't do that. Instead of having 2 12AX7 gain stages, they have 1 pentode gain stage, which is going to have roughly double the gain, I guess, so it replaces 2 stages. And they use one of those tubes, a 6A and 8, that has a pentode section and a triode section. The pentode section is that gain stage, the triode section is a short tail phase inverter. And so this design is clever in that they got 1 tube to replace what other amps would use 2 tubes to do. Now, what's that say? Was there a better way to do it than essentially Leo Fender did it and that basically got copied into every friggin' amp known to mankind? Yeah, that's entirely possible. I do not believe Leo did it because it was the best way to do it. But at the same time, that kind of screams cost cutting to me. Maybe I'm a bit biased. I don't know. I have nothing against Sunn. It's just, well, maybe that was common back then. And it was a good idea back then when they had a variety of tubes to work with, but herein lies the problem that we have today. The 6AN8 is a rare NOS tube. I can't just pop out and grab one at the store. Now, if I go to my usual supplier, $27.95. That's US. Here in Canada, we're looking at $35.99, $35 for a tube. And the fact that it has no pictures, it even says assorted brands in stock. So maybe, you don't get the one you want, or you get one you like and then you reorder and you don't get that one again. That's a problem to me. I like consistency. The fact that it's priced that way, well, obviously it's in demand because we have vintage tube amps that use it. Let's compare it to another similar tube. When trying to research tubes I could substitute, I found that this one seemed to fit. The 6U8A. Well, geez, that's only $12. And they show a picture. Chances are, if you order this guy and you need another one, you're going to be able to get another one. But I could literally almost buy 3 of these tubes for the price of one of those. So if we set up the amp for this and buy 3 tubes for the price of one, we got, many, many years of playing. And that's exactly what I did, because part of what I'm going to be doing with this amp is I'm going to be trying to substitute out that tube and see how well it works with not the original tubes. Some might consider that treachery. I call it adventure. What's the worst that can happen? Doesn't work well and I have to rewire the socket back? Truth told, I've already rewired this socket for testing purposes. I set it up with a 12AX7. I basically just rewired the pin out. We already got 1, 2, 3 on this side. So with just a couple shuffling of wires on this side, I got this changed to a pentode section. Now I find that decreased the output, but I can't be certain because of the other major problem this amp has. And that is, it has a blown output transformer, or at least that's what was told to me. And indeed, when playing through the amp after I kind of got it working, it was kind of like, it was making fizzy noises. Now, when I substituted it with another transformer, those fizzy noises went away. Because of how this amp's wired, I didn't do a correct substitute. You see, if you look here, this transformer has the screen grid taps. In order to retrofit the replacement transformer into it, or the test transformer, I just did the triode thing where I connected the screen grids to the anode with 1K resistors. Now that's going to have your output right there. This thing's likely to be louder if I wire it up correctly. So, it might still perform well with just a 12AX7, but really, no, we're looking at this circuit. It's a bit weak if that's just a triode. We probably need to get that gain up. Now, one of the reasons why I look at this amp and I say, oh, this is a cost-cutting design, is the power supply section. So this amp's a 1970. That schematic's from 68. There's obviously been changes because it says right here 500 volts coming off the rectifier. That's not true. This amp here is running at 600 volts. Definitely 600 volts. And the capacitors that it came with are 600 volts. Straight up 600 volts. So we have a situation where this amp was built with like the minimum requirements on it. Just like, we just by a hair, we're within spec. No facility for derating whatsoever. God forbid those transformers age and start to lose their ratings. Oh, gee, you wouldn't think that maybe 30 years later the amp would blow up because of that. Sorry, 50 years later. Now, this amp has been serviced by someone before me. And well, I think that was a fun time because obviously it had a blown rectifier and they went and replaced it with one of these yellow jacket dealies. You know, we have an old tube amp come in for repair. It's got 50-year-old capacitors and it blew a rectifier. Oh, these resistors here, someone's replaced those. Maybe those were burned out too. Those are definitely not original. Let's, not actually fix the amp. Let's not address the problems that it has. Let's not touch on the fact that it has ancient capacitors that desperately need to be changed. Let's just brute force it by putting a silicon diode rectifier into it because it will instantly blow a tube rectifier. Yeah, let's just brute force it back to life and let the client keep using it until it takes out the output transformer. Yeah, that's a great idea. So that's one of the first things we're doing today. We are rebuilding this power supply and we are redesigning it too because I don't like that. That's not good enough. Hey, how much you figure this is worth on eBay to vintage enthusiasts who drink Kool-Aid? Here we have a bias capacitor. Yeah, that's definitely coming out. That'll be an easy replacement. This chunk here is just 1-to-1. It's going to be what's there. Yeah, these caps are just slipping right out. Either they designed them for servicing, easy replacements so that you didn't have to uncoil a wire, or again, they just kind of hammered it in there. Look at those old beasts. I might as well price those right now while I'm at it. Well, there are generic parts that I generally tend to use because, most all amps use the same values for certain functions, but this guy beefs it up. We have 50 150 volts for the bias capacitors as opposed to the typical 10. Well, too bad, you're getting 47 160. However, these are Rubicon BXCs. Those are 105C, I think 12,000 hour rated capacitors, so look at that, bud. These guys are gonna fit nice in here. Okay, let's remember to put the capacitor on the correct way, right? That would be advantageous. And we'll wrap those connectors around right nice so it's real hard for the next guy to replace them, right? There you go. That's one bias cap resolved. It's kind of hanging on there, but don't really have the opportunity to use the original clips. Now this guy over here grounds here, and then the connection's right up here. Now, I don't know if there's a particular rhyme or reason why it would ground out here. And obviously our new capacitor's not going to reach that far. We need to find another ground point. Oh, well, the bias pot's right here. One of those, it grounds to the tube socket. Is that a stretch we can make? Kind of is. Not ideal, but it kind of is. You gotta get these 1Ks out of the way there. So if I had to move this, I could also put it right on the potentiometer. And then that would be less of a stretch. However, one thing I need to do while I'm in here is establish some bias test points. That entails fixing on this tube socket. So that's pin 1 right there. So we got to establish all our grounds to that. But we need to jump from pin 1 to pin 8 with a 1 ohm resistor. For that, I have 1 ohm 3 watt. I believe these are 1 or 2% for accurate measuring. All right, socket number 1, got our test point resistor in stock. Stick it out a bit so that you can clamp onto it. And I did exactly what I suggested I was going to do with the bias capacitor. Yeah, it's kind of floating there. I'm not 100% happy with that method of doing things, but it's going to be fine, I think, for the most part. It's not a particularly heavy component. That's what's great about these new capacitors. They're so small and lightweight compared to the old ones. All right, another bias test resistor in place. Because we're done with those tube sockets and the bias circuit now has fresh capacitors. We gotta start pulling this crap apart now. We're not gonna be able to keep track as well of what's going on with this because I just pretty much have to pull it apart. That old cap has gotta go. And lucky for me, they didn't actually bother wrapping the wires. So it's gonna come right apart. Whee! Whee! So what is this resistor network they installed here? Blue, gray, orange. That's what, 68K? So a pair of 68Ks to make a 34K. The actual spec calls for a 15K 2 watt. Now, mind you, the actual spec starts at 500 volts, so maybe there was a 33K resistor on there. Well, hold on here. So it says we're going from 480 to 425. So let's do some maths. 480 take away 425 is a 55 watt voltage drop. Now, if we divide that by the 15,000 ohms on the rating, that's 3.6, or we'll say 3.7 milliamps current draw, which sounds about right for a preamp with that few tubes in it. So if we're going from 600 volts to 425, that's a 175 volt drop. Divide that by the current draw, and we get 47K recommended resistor. So yeah, I guess that was in the general correct range. Now, that 600 empty, it's probably gonna sag down into the 590s with the tubes installed, so maybe 33K is actually appropriate. This appears to be a ground star from the preamp. There's like 3 different ground points all around this. We might be respecking out the ground on this a little bit too. Now, removing these old capacitors is a bit of a process, but at least it's more straightforward than the ones that solder directly onto the chassis. Now, they are kind of, you know, we have these twistema thingers that we to try to straighten out, save that we don't actually break them off. You know, the capacitor's realistically garbage, but I'm just, you know, delicate. Yeah, it's not coming off without a fight, so... Sorry, Mr. Capacitor. Not sure if you had resale value on eBay. Not that you can't still use this capacitor, you just get a standard capacitor clamp. Clamp it down. That third one is going to be tricky because it's all covered in solder. Oh, look at that. That solder just broke right off. It wasn't, that was a cold solder joint. And it's off. Now we got to get this thing off, which pretty much you drill. Oh, that was easy. So they don't really make 600 volt capacitors anymore. Like they might, but they're gonna be for industry and not necessarily in the values that we need. So we're gonna have to use some more common tube amp type transformers. That means installing capacitor clamps. Is that gonna, oh yeah, close enough, close enough. Now, here's the thing. We're using 500 volt capacitors. And with 500 volt capacitors, that means we gotta kind of double them up to get the voltage handling. So that's exactly what I'm doing, doubling them up. But that also means I need to pop another hole in this pupper, which is treachery, putting a hole in a vintage amp. Well, yes, to better this frigging power supply, with this comes a further power supply redesign. Starts off from our rectifier via our standby switch. We need to hit one section of capacitance, we go through our choke, and then another section of capacitance. Now, something that's commonly done is they use a dual capacitor, right? These guys have 2 capacitors in one, 2 terminals, a common ground. This is commonly used in a lot of amps to go, you know, do 2 points of capacitance. However, we need to double these guys up. So we have a dual 100, and that is going to connect in series to the second dual 100. Now this is our point of ground. Then this is going to go out to the rest of the power supply. Now, when we put the 2 100s in parallel like that, it's going to make a single 200. Now, if you know how capacitors work, when you put them in series like this to get the higher voltage, it splits that capacity in half. So this is going to act like a single 100, and these dual 100s are going to act like a pair of 50s. And that's what we're going for, especially with a tube rectifier. We can't really exceed 50 UFs. I'd even maybe like to go a little bit less than that, but this is the easiest, cheapest way to do this, kind of staying within the spirit of how this amp was built and designed, while also not costing me money on an amp that I'm not invested in. Now, usually when you do this kind of thing, you have balancing resistors. And to figure out your balancing resistors, it's 50 divided by the capacitance. And the capacitance is not 50U. The capacitance will be 50, the U, times 10 to the power of -6. That's going to give us our actual capacitance value. We kind of need to bust ours out a scientific calculator to do that kind of computation. So we got 50U times 10, XY here, 6 plus minus equals 0.005. That's, you see, because the 50U, that U is actually an M. That's the M symbol for micro. So it's 50 microfarads. Not even millifarads, microfarads. Very few actual farads are we dealing with in these guys. The actual farad is 0.0005. So 50 divided by 0.0005 is 1 million ohms. So that's 1 meg. Except the screw up that I've done here is that you're going to base on full capacity, not half capacity. It's usually how it's done. Now, capacity working with 100 sections. So 100 U, 0.001, so 50. Well, I can guess that is already. Is 500,000. So our balance for the first section is going to be 470K. So that's the closest. Right, close. And you'll go to 200 sections. 220K. On this section, resistance, balancer, 220K. Connects to the middle. That's going to be a 470K, but also for the other side, writing all over ourselves here, a 470K. And so yes, if this chicken scratch hieroglyphics makes sense to you, that is how we're going to redo this bit right here. After that, we're expecting a voltage drop down to 425, which means we're going to be able to use common capacitors, in which make an appearance once again, Rubicon BXCs, 22,500 volts. 105C, 12,000 hour rated. Let's get a hole punched in this thing. Let's plot out a hole first. So it needs to go over here somewhere. We'll roughly kind of pilot these out. You know, we can get into some intense measurements, but at the end of the day, I'm just gonna eyeball it. There's no reason why this won't fit in the box after this, right? No, it all looks the same in there. I'm just gonna go ahead, trace this out, approximate roughly center. And then we're calling in the consultant. This steel might be a bit tougher. Let's get a pilot hole in there, see how well this is gonna go over. Yeah, it drilled pretty nice actually. I'm hoping my largest chassis pump, yeah, gonna be about right. You just need to make a hole big enough to get the shank here through. Yeah, we'll just comb through it till we get it up to the size we want. Looks like that's just big enough. Using chassis punches is kind of fun. Just gotta make sure we get some lubricant on the bearing surfaces so it doesn't screw it up. I'm gonna be putting a fair amount of force on this guy. I wish I knew then what I knew now, and my chassis punches would be sharper. Make sure we're not catching any wires. No, we're clear. We can start just Hassendeffering on it. This process that takes a little bit of patience. Almost through. Gotta keep an eye on it, because at some point you get through, but it doesn't necessarily feel like you get through, and then if you keep going, you can damage the tip on your punch. And boop! Oh, look at this guy. It's a taco! Yay! Okay, so we need one capacitor. Where is other capacitor? I brought two over. Oh, come on now. Right here. And we can't really stick them right next to each other. One's gonna get offset. Good news is the chassis punched hole doesn't really need a whole heck of a lot of chamfering and deburring, but those newly drilled holes definitely do. And consistent with the theme on how they're previously installed. Yes, rivet guns are my friends, sir. Now, you might find it hard to get into tight space with the old rivet gun, but, you know, I stack on this tiny little nut, then this less tiny nut, and that spaces things out a bit. All right, let's see if we can't get these poppers into place. Oh, yeah. Yeah, like, oh, yeah. Better, yeah. Caps. We're gonna cap that ours. Yeah, I gotta decide on our final orientation, but hey, we're off to a great start. Key term start, because we're not going to be able to hook up all little connections for the rest of the power supply section on this the way we did before. So we have a ground bus over here. Chances are we're going to pull that over to a capacitor. So we'll orient that way. Wait, why? What? Wait, that was connected to the capacitor via... Why did they have this circuit grounded there like that and then have this... I guess even though that's tied down, it doesn't actually count as a ground point. Maybe they had some secrets and tips and tricks to using a ground plane that I'm not aware of. Mind you, yeah, really. The capacitor was grounded down. That was grounded there. That's just creating a ground loop. Why would they do that way? We're still going to pull ground from over here because that was where the main power cap that we're building right now was grounded. 105C 600 volt rated insulation, 20 gauge. The good stuff. Oh, the 220's going in. I don't know that I need a value higher than 1 watt for this purpose. Balance resistor, also doubling as the jumper, connecting the two halves together. All right, our capacitor stack is done and in place with our balancing resistors. It's ready to start getting hooked up. The choke binds to the B plus over here with an extra long B plus wire. We need to get a wire here to, I guess we'll go this side. And nothing else connects directly to the B plus. It goes through the choke and everything feeds post choke. It's one of those designs. Not that I know that there's anything bad with that. I just kind of wish that went all the way there. All right, our B plus is established now. Our B plus and choke intersect here. It goes out the choke that way, and bomb, we got capacitance. Nothing else has to connect to here. Everything else connects to here. We have a choke that's going to return power, and then that has to feed out to our dropping. So now we have to rebuild the preamp power supply and also figure out what we're doing with all these ground wires. All right, while you weren't paying attention, I just kind of got into the zone here and I got this power supply done. Now, certain sacrifices had to be made. I had to like undo some of the nice artistic wrap that they had going on there so that I could reroute some of these wires where I needed them to get. I added this terminal strip on here so I could reconnect everything that was part of the, preamp power supply stepping down. All this going onings right here. We got the choke connected on to the other side of the B plus here. And this red wire we found, it goes out downrange to connect to the output transformer. Just had to extend with this purple wire over to here, and then it steps down the way as prescribed on the schematic. As far as the capacitors, I realized I could repurpose these clamps that held the bias capacitors in place to hold these new power supply capacitors. Just put a little heat shrink over there to keep them nice, and they're solid on there now. Now on the power supply schematic, we have A, B, and C. A being the B plus, B being mostly just the phase inverter, and then C being the rest of the preamp. Going down line here, this would be B to the phase inverter. You see there's no capacitor because that wire literally just goes right here where I was able to connect it directly to the capacitor. And then of course we go down to C, put a capacitor in, no problem. Now best I could tell, they had something resembling a star ground going on here. All those points that were connected around the big can cap, that was all just a star ground. All the grounds that were running various circuits in the amp converged on that one location. So I've re-simulated the star ground on this particular lug, which isn't connected to the chassis. You see the lug has points that are connected to the chassis, but I didn't use them for grounding because, I could just do it on this, have a proper lifted ground, bring us a little bit closer to the blueprinting that I would rather have. So it's weird because we have circumstances in which we have ground points like here, where the center tap for the heater connects here. It's bonded to the chassis, yet they still have a separate wire that went to the capacitor over here. It's ground, bonded to the chassis again. It's almost like they grounded this amp in such a way that it's not dependent on the chassis. Like if you lose any of those ground points, the amp's still gonna function. They made a point to put all the wires still there. So yeah, basically converged onto this point. We, keeping with their way of doing things, we, ran a wire from the bottom of the filter supply to there. We connected that, and then we have a connection to the rest of the preamp. This wire here is actually very integral because it's part of this bundle here that runs the bottom cathode of the power tubes and then goes on to feed the phase inverter. But then another one splits off and goes to feed the preamp, the rest of the preamp over here. And okay, we have the input jack. It's going to be grounded to the chassis, but then they also ran a wire to ground it to this point here, which is also grounded to the chassis, which runs back out to the bundle on the tube socket. So technically this guy's got multiple ground loops going on in it. But I guess the technology they have going on here isn't that susceptible. It's not going to be high gain enough. So I guess it still runs quiet. And on the good news is if you did want to blueprint this grounding scheme, lifting all those grounds, separating from the chassis, it wouldn't be too hard to do because they already have all the lines in place for you. Meanwhile, I did some a little bit tweaking, tweaking on bias cap here. I'm probably going to stick some hot snot, some hot glue in here to kind of secure it better, even though this is kind of waggly in and of itself. Over here, the one that I added off the tube socket, well, I've reversed it so that it's, hard to the chassis. I could maybe stick a piece of double-sided tape underneath of it or maybe glue it to the chassis. I don't know how well it would work glued to the chassis, but I'll have a better chance of being able to secure this after so it can't vibrate too much. Because that's what you have to worry about, especially in a bass amp. Stuff's gonna vibrate mad in here and it's gonna start taking itself apart, right? So the next step of this phase operation is I'm gonna reconnect the stock output transformer. Testing on this now with a rebuilt power supply. Also testing the rebuilt power supply. Trying to see, determined if maybe the power supply transformer was the problem, or if there was just a power issue. So yeah, how do we go about, I gotta remember, I ripped this guy apart. I just gonna have to look at the schematic here and retrace my steps. Okay, I think this thing's all hooked up now. I guess we can test on it. We'll start off by putting that silly yellow jacket back into place and checking on our power supply. Stupid frickin' people upgrade amps, big ass 14 gauge cables. It's an awesome cable, but it's unruly. Oh yeah, something I wanted to do real quick while I'm in here. It's like it's kind of dumb they never disconnected this phase switch. Which I'm thinking, what I'm gonna do is I'm going to put a dual rectifier on this. It'd be nice to get that phase switch to do something. Okay, no explosion so far. Grab a ground point. Our B plus is right here. 630 volts. But no load, right? So between these two capacitors should be like half that. Sure, not quite. 629, 629. That should be 628. Nine. This should be some dropping. 607. That should be more dropping. 597. So right now, without load, our droppers aren't doing frig all. How are we doing for negative voltage on the bias circuit? 77 volts, 80 volts. It's all arbitrary. Where's that 100K stack? Right here. 77 volts bias. Okay. Everything seems to be working how it should be. So far, so good. Let's pop some power tubes in there. And a little bit of speaker load. Let's let those heaters roast up. We'll thwap some scrap but good preamp tubes in here. All right, so now with this meter, let's grab our star ground here again. Let's get ourselves a method to turn this bias pat. It's adjustable from inside and out. Fire it up. Now, what B plus are we calibrating for? 609, 610. All right, 48. So let's calibrate some 48 here. All right, now what voltages do we have on our preamp circuit? So here, 600 volts, sure. Stepping down, 430. Okay, what were we supposed to get? 425. Honestly, that's close enough. I guess these resistors were a decent choice. And finally, 331, supposed to be 320. Close enough for testing purposes. Putting out more hum than I feel it should. Well, let's go grab an instrument and see what happens. Well, it is a bass amp after all. Yeah, you hear that? After a certain point. And that's the same symptom as before. The symptom that went away when we changed the output transformer. Let's get a voltage. Yeah, we see voltage fluctuations there. And now it's not coming back. The amp would function under these circumstances, assuming this was working correctly. Sounds like the beginning of gratitude. Okay, so clearly this amp is still messed up. Now, again, I did test on this previously. I kind of spliced in a spare output transformer there to see if that solved the problem. And the problem did go away. So we're gonna kind of write this guy off for now until we can maybe flop her into a different amp and see what happens. So I gotta replace the output transformer on this. Now, fortunately, in the aftermath of Project Jubilee, I have this fairly sized unit of the transformer that came out of the Trainer Voicemaster. And it is slightly larger than what Trainer usually puts in their 50 watt or 2-tube rated amps. It is, you know, a fair size compared to other 50 watt 2-tube amps. And I've ran this with 2 KT88s before and got excellent results. Compared to the original transformer, we are, oh boy, almost a ½ inch shorter. Maybe not quite that shorter. Trainer has about the same or slightly wider a core, like maybe by 1 or 2 lamination pieces. Width-wise, this transformer is clearly bigger. but this transformer is no slouch, and I think it will do well on here. The only problem is this guy does not have the screen taps. I'm not gonna get into that right now, but that's, you know, these little guys here that connect to the screen grid. You know what that means? We need to further expand on this power supply circuit so that we can build a screen grid power supply. And because KT88's running at 600 volts, well, typically amps of this type don't just do the conventional screen grid power supply. They often have a whole separate power supply. So we're gonna have to use some trickery to get the voltages to where we want. In the meantime, that's enough for today. In the next episode, we are going to deal with that, and I will get in more depth about it, and I'll show you what solution I come up with. So stay tuned. That's been sitting on my shelf for 2 years now. We're finally gonna get it running. Hopefully running just as well as new, if not better.